soldier in insubordination. We strongly recommend you take the retirement option." David's heart sank. 15 years of service, a spotless record, commendations and awards all coming to an end because he wouldn't remove a medal he'd earned saving his fellow soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Sir," David said carefully, "may I ask what would happen to my benefits if I chose retirement?" The legal officer answered, "You'd receive 70% of the pension you would have earned with 20 years of service. Your healthcare benefits would continue but at a reduced level. It's not ideal, but it's better than losing everything in a court-martial." David thought about Linda and the kids, about the mortgage on their house and the college funds they'd been building. The reduced benefits would make things difficult, but they could survive. A dishonorable discharge would leave them with nothing. "How long do I have to decide?" David asked. 48 hours, General Morrison replied. "I'm sorry, Thompson. I wish there was another way." Meanwhile, the media coverage of David's case had evolved into something larger. What started as a story about one soldier's defiance had become a national conversation about military service, racial justice, and the treatment of veterans. The hashtags had multiplied. Justice for Thompson, our military pride. Stand for principle, each representing different aspects of the debate. The contempt hearing had taken place the week before, and Judge Blackwell had been unmoved by the legal arguments about discrimination and military protocol. He'd sentenced David to 30 days in jail, suspended pending good behavior, and a fine of $5,000. More importantly, he'd barred David from testifying in the Richardson case, effectively ending the prosecution's chances of getting a conviction. Richardson's defense team had been quick to claim victory. At a press conference outside the courthouse, lead attorney Hamilton Cross had declared, "This case shows what happens when prosecutors rely on unreliable witnesses with personal agendas. Our client has been vindicated, and we look forward to his complete exoneration." The corruption case had indeed collapsed without David's testimony. The financial records he'd discovered were still evidence, but without someone to explain their significance and authenticate them, the jury was confused and skeptical. Richardson had been acquitted on all charges after just 2 days of deliberation. The verdict had sparked outrage among veterans groups and good government organizations. They pointed out that hundreds of thousands of dollars meant to help wounded veterans had been stolen, and the only person being punished was the soldier who'd tried to expose the theft. Senator Patricia Davis had called for a congressional investigation into the entire affair. "When our justice system punishes whistleblowers and protects thieves, something is fundamentally wrong," she'd declared on the Senate floor. Sergeant Thompson risked his life for this country in Afghanistan, and he risked his career to protect veterans here at home. He deserves our support, not our condemnation. But the political winds were complicated. Some conservative commentators had praised Judge Blackwell for maintaining courtroom discipline and civilian authority over the military. They argued that David's defiance, however well-intentioned, set a dangerous precedent that could undermine democratic institutions. The debate had even reached international audiences. European newspapers ran editorial pieces about American military culture and racial justice. Asian media outlets covered the story as an example of the tensions within American society. The case had become bigger than any of the participants had ever imagined. David's family had been through their own ordeal during these weeks. The constant media attention had made normal life impossible. Linda had lost her nursing job after the hospital received complaints from patients who disagreed with David's actions. The kids were struggling in school, where they faced both support and criticism from classmates and their families. Their finances were already strained from legal fees and lost income, and the prospect of reduced military benefits made the future look even more uncertain. Linda had been supportive throughout everything, but David could see the stress wearing on her. "Whatever you decide," she told him the night before his deadline, "I'll support you. But I need you to be honest with me about what we're facing." David held her close, feeling the weight of responsibility for his family's future. "If I take the retirement, we'll be okay financially. It'll be tight, but we'll manage. If I fight this and lose at court-martial, we could lose everything." Their 10-year-old son, Danny, had been surprisingly perceptive about the situation. "Dad," he'd asked a few days earlier, "did you do something wrong?" David had struggled to explain the complex moral and legal issues to a child. "I did what I thought was right, son. Sometimes doing the right thing has consequences, even when you're trying to help people. But you saved those soldiers in Afghanistan, right? And you were trying to help other soldiers who got their money stolen. That's right. Then you did the right thing, Danny had concluded with the certainty that only children possess. Even if the grown-ups don't understand. The decision came down to the final hours. David spent the night walking around the base, visiting places that had been important to him during his 15 years of service. He stopped by the training facilities where he'd taught hundreds of young soldiers, the barracks where he'd lived as a new recruit, the memorial garden where fallen soldiers were remembered. At dawn, he found himself standing in front of the flagpole where colors were raised every morning. He thought about the oath he'd taken as an 18-year-old recruit, promising to defend the Constitution and obey the orders of his superiors. He'd kept that oath faithfully for 15 years, until the moment when those two commitments came into conflict. David reported to General Morrison's office at exactly 8 o'clock, his decision made. The same group of officers was assembled, their faces showing they already knew what he would choose. "Sir," David said formally, "I accept the retirement option." General Morrison nodded sadly. "Very well, Sergeant Thompson. Your retirement will be effective in 30 days. I want you to know that this decision doesn't reflect our opinion of your character or your service. You're a good soldier who found himself in an impossible situation." The paperwork was processed quickly, and within a week, David was clearing out his office and turning in his equipment. His fellow instructors held a small farewell gathering, where many of them expressed their support and admiration for the stand he'd taken. Command Sergeant Major Williams presented David with a flag that had flown over the base, folded with military precision. "This is for what you did in Afghanistan," he said quietly, "and for what you did in that courtroom." Both took the same kind of courage. David's retirement ceremony was small and private, attended only by his family and closest military friends. General Morrison spoke briefly about David's service and sacrifice, carefully avoiding mention of the controversy that had ended his career. The Bronze Star gleamed on David's chest one last time as he received his retirement certificate and final salute. The transition to civilian life was harder than David had expected. His military skills didn't translate easily to civilian jobs, and his notoriety made some employers reluctant to hire him. Some saw him as a troublemaker, while others worried about the media attention he might bring. Linda found work as a school nurse, but her salary was much less than what she'd earned at the hospital. They had to sell their house and move to a smaller apartment. The kids adjusted to new schools and a lower standard of living, but they seemed to understand that their father had made a difficult choice for important reasons. David eventually found work as a security guard at a veterans hospital, where his military experience was valued and his story was understood. It wasn't the career he'd planned, but it felt right to be serving veterans again, even in a different capacity. 2 years later, David received an unexpected phone call. A congressional investigation had uncovered new evidence of Richardson's financial crimes, including records that hadn't been available during the original trial. Richardson was facing new charges, and this time the evidence was strong enough that David's testimony might not be needed. The investigation also revealed that Judge Blackwell had financial connections to Richardson's family that should have required him to recuse himself from the case. An ethics investigation was underway, and there was talk of overturning David's contempt conviction. But for David, the vindication felt hollow. Richardson might finally face justice and David's name might be cleared, but 15 years of military service were still over. The career he'd loved, the soldiers he'd trained, the life he'd built in the Army, none of that could be restored. Still, David didn't regret his decision. The Bronze Star sat in a place of honor in their small apartment, and sometimes his children would ask him to tell them again about the day he'd earned it. He would describe the burning vehicle, the wounded soldiers, the choice between safety and duty, and sometimes they would ask about the day in the courtroom, when he'd made a different but equally difficult choice. David would explain again about integrity and principles, about standing up for what's right even when the cost is high. "Would you do it again, Dad?" Danny asked one evening as they looked at the medal together. David was quiet for a moment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Staff Sergeant David Thompson walked toward his office. It was just another Tuesday at Fort Liberty, where he'd been stationed for the past 3 years. At 32, David had already served his country for 14 years, rising through the ranks with a spotless record and the respect of everyone who knew him. David wasn't just any soldier. He was an instructor, teaching young recruits the skills they'd need to survive in combat. His classroom walls were covered with photos from his deployments, training certificates, and letters from soldiers he'd trained who later wrote to thank him. But among all these mementos, one thing stood out: a small Bronze Star medal displayed in a frame on his desk. That medal told a story that David rarely talked about. 3 years ago, during his deployment in Afghanistan, his unit had come under heavy fire while on patrol. An improvised explosive device had hit their convoy, leaving 3 soldiers wounded and trapped in the burning vehicle. Without thinking about his own safety, David had run through enemy gunfire not once but 3 times, pulling each wounded soldier to safety. The 3rd soldier, barely 18 years old, would have died if David hadn't gone back for him. The Bronze Star with Valor was the military's way of saying thank you for that day. But for David, it represented something deeper: the oath he'd taken to never leave a fellow soldier behind. Every morning when he put on his uniform, he remembered that young soldier's face and the promise he'd made to himself to always do what was right, no matter the cost. David had grown up in a small town in Georgia, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher. His father had served in Vietnam and taught him that military service was about more than just following orders. It was about honor, integrity, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. His mother had instilled in him the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. These values had guided David throughout his military career. He'd never been one to cause trouble or question authority unnecessarily. He followed orders, respected the chain of command, and earned his promotions through hard work and dedication. His fellow soldiers looked up to him, and his superiors trusted him with important responsibilities. One of those responsibilities had recently put David in an uncomfortable position. 6 months ago, he'd been assigned as the unit's financial liaison, helping to oversee how money allocated for veteran support programs was being spent. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, just making sure receipts were filed properly and budgets were followed. But as David dug into the financial records, he began to notice things that didn't add up. Money that was supposed to go toward helping wounded veterans transition back to civilian life was being redirected to other projects. Equipment purchases that never seemed to arrive. Training programs that existed on paper but never actually happened. At first, David thought it might be simple accounting errors. Military bureaucracy was complicated and mistakes happened. But the more he investigated, the clearer it became that this wasn't accidental. Someone was deliberately stealing money meant to help veterans who had sacrificed for their country. The trail led directly to Lieutenant Colonel Richardson, David's former commanding officer. Richardson came from a military family with connections that reached all the way to Washington. His father was a retired general, his brother worked in the Pentagon, and he was being considered for promotion to full colonel. He was also, according to the evidence David had uncovered, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from veteran support funds. David had struggled with what to do. Richardson had been his commanding officer for 2 years, and during that time had been a mentor and friend. They'd served together in Afghanistan, and Richardson had personally recommended David for his Bronze Star. The idea that this man he'd respected and trusted was stealing from wounded veterans was almost impossible to believe, but the evidence was undeniable. David had copies of financial records, emails, and documents that clearly showed how the money was being diverted. Richardson was using the funds to pay for personal expenses, unauthorized travel, and even improvements to his private residence. Money that should have been helping veterans learn new job skills or get medical treatment was instead buying luxury items for Richardson's family. David knew he had to report what he'd found. His military training and personal values left him no choice, but he also knew that reporting a superior officer, especially one with Richardson's connections, would likely end his own career. The military didn't always protect whistleblowers even when they were right. Still, David couldn't live with himself if he stayed silent. He thought about the young soldiers he taught, many of whom would one day need the very programs that Richardson was stealing from. He thought about his own father, who'd struggled to readjust after Vietnam with little help from the government he'd served. Most of all, he thought about the oath he'd taken when he first put on the Uniformed to defend the Constitution and protect those who couldn't protect themselves, David had followed proper procedures when he reported his findings. He'd gone to the Inspector General's office, provided all his evidence, and answered every question they'd asked. He'd done everything by the book, hoping that the system would work as it was supposed to. The investigation had taken months, during which time David had to continue working under Richardson's command. It was awkward and uncomfortable, especially since Richardson clearly suspected that David was the source of the investigation. But David had maintained his professionalism and continued doing his job to the best of his ability. Now, as David sat at his desk that Tuesday morning, he noticed an official-looking envelope that had been placed on top of his usual paperwork. The return address showed it was from the district court, and David's stomach dropped as he realized what it probably contained. Sure enough, when he opened the envelope, he found a subpoena ordering him to appear in court the following week to testify in the case against Lieutenant Colonel Richardson. The investigation had apparently found enough evidence to bring criminal charges, and David's testimony would be crucial to proving the case. David stared at the subpoena for a long moment, understanding that this piece of paper would change everything. Once he testified, there would be no going back. His military career, his relationships with fellow officers, his entire future would be affected by what he said in that courtroom. But as David looked up at the bronze star on his desk, he knew he didn't really have a choice. Just as he'd risked his life to save those soldiers in Afghanistan, he now had to risk his career to protect the veterans who depended on these programs. It was what his father would have done, what his mother had taught him was right, and what his oath as a soldier demanded. David carefully folded the subpoena and placed it in his desk drawer. He had a week to prepare, a week to gather his thoughts and steel himself for what was coming. He knew that testifying against Richardson wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. As he began planning what he would wear to court, David's hand instinctively went to the ribbon rack on his uniform. His bronze star was there, along with the other medals and ribbons he'd earned during his years of service. He'd wear his dress uniform to court, as was appropriate for such an important occasion. After all, he was representing not just himself, but all the soldiers who'd served with honor and integrity. David had no way of knowing that this simple decision to wear his medals to court would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately cost him everything he'd worked for. All he knew was that he had a duty to fulfill, and he intended to fulfill it with the same courage and honor that had earned him that bronze star in the first place. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and camera crews when David arrived. That Monday morning, the case had attracted more attention than he'd expected, partly because of Lieutenant Colonel Richardson's family connections, and partly because of the large amount of money involved. David had tried to avoid the media, entering through a side door, but he could still hear the buzz of activity outside. David had spent the weekend preparing for this moment. He'd reviewed all the financial documents one more time, organized his thoughts, and practiced answering the questions the prosecutor had warned him about. His wife had helped him press his dress uniform until every crease was perfect, and she'd made sure all his ribbons and medals were positioned exactly right. The bronze star sat prominently among his decorations, polished to a mirror shine. David had earned the right to wear it, and military protocol required him to wear his full dress uniform when appearing in official proceedings. He felt confident that he was following all the proper procedures. Judge Harrison Blackwell had been on the bench for over 20 years, and his reputation preceded him. Known for running a strict courtroom, he demanded absolute respect for his authority and had little patience for anything he considered showboating or grandstanding. At 62 years old, he'd seen it all, and he prided himself on maintaining order and decorum in his court. The judge had grown up in a different era when things were more black and white in his mind. He believed in clear lines of authority and didn't appreciate what he saw as attempts to influence juries through emotional appeals. He'd already decided that this case, with all its media attention, would be handled with extra strictness to prevent any circus-like atmosphere. As the morning session began, the courtroom was packed. Lieutenant Colonel Richardson sat at the defense table with his expensive lawyers, looking calm and confident. His family filled the first row behind him: his father, the retired general, his brother from the Pentagon, and other relatives who'd come to show support. David waited in the witness room until he was called. When his name was announced, he walked into the courtroom with the same bearing he'd learned in basic training: shoulders back, head high, eyes forward. He was nervous, but he was also determined to do his duty. The prosecutor, a young woman named Assistant District Attorney Collins, had explained to David that his testimony would be crucial. The financial records he'd discovered were damning, but without someone who could explain what they meant and how the scheme worked, the jury might not understand the full scope of Richardson's crimes. As David approached the witness stand, he could feel every eye in the courtroom on him. He raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, then sat down and waited for the questions to begin. But before the prosecutor could ask her first question, Judge Blackwell's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Sergeant Thompson," the judge said, his tone already showing disapproval. "Before we proceed, I need you to remove that medal from your uniform." David blinked, not sure he'd heard correctly. He looked at the prosecutor, who seemed just as surprised as he was. "Your Honor, I'm sorry, but I don't understand. This is my military dress uniform, and I'm required to wear it for official proceedings." Judge Blackwell's face grew stern. The bronze star seemed to catch his attention particularly. Gleaming under the courtroom lights, "I will not have witnesses in my courtroom using military decorations to influence the jury or gain sympathy." "Remove that medal immediately." The prosecutor stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. Sergeant Thompson is in proper military dress uniform as required by military protocol. The medals are part of his official uniform." "Overruled," Judge Blackwell replied sharply. "This is my courtroom and I decide what is appropriate. I've seen too many cases where veterans try to use their service to sway juries. That medal stays off or this witness will be held in contempt." David felt his heart racing. He looked around the courtroom, seeing the confusion on faces in the gallery. Richardson's defense attorney was smiling slightly, clearly pleased with this unexpected development. The retired general in the front row was nodding approvingly at the judge's decision. "Your Honor," David said carefully, "with respect, this bronze star was awarded for actions in combat. It's part of my official uniform and I earned the right to wear it." The judge's voice grew louder. "I don't care what you think you've earned, Sergeant. In my courtroom, you follow my rules. You will remove that medal, or you will be removed from this courtroom." "The choice is yours," David's mind raced. He thought about all the times he'd been taught to respect authority, to follow orders without question. But he also thought about what that medal represented, not just his own actions, but the principle that soldiers should never abandon their fellow soldiers, no matter the cost. He remembered the young soldier he'd saved in Afghanistan, barely 18 years old with his whole life ahead of him. He thought about the wounded veterans who weren't getting the help they needed because Richardson had stolen their money. He thought about his father, who'd taught him that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were against you. The courtroom was completely silent now, waiting for David's response. Judge Blackwell drummed his fingers impatiently on the bench. The prosecutor looked worried, knowing that losing David's testimony could seriously damage their case. Richardson's lawyers whispered among themselves, probably hoping David would be removed so he couldn't testify at all. David stood up slowly, coming to attention as he'd been trained to do. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, though his heart was pounding. "Your Honor, I understand that this is your courtroom and I respect your authority, but I cannot remove this medal." The judge's face turned red with anger. "Excuse me? Did you just refuse a direct order from this court?" "Your Honor, this bronze star represents more than just my actions. It represents the soldiers I saved, the oath I took to serve my country, and the integrity that brought me here to testify today. To remove it would dishonor not just myself, but every soldier who has served with honor." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers. Some people seemed to support David's position, while others appeared shocked that anyone would defy a judge's order. Judge Blackwell slammed his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. "That's enough," the judge shouted. "Bailiff, remove this witness from my courtroom. Sergeant Thompson, you are hereby held in contempt of court. Your refusal to follow a lawful order shows exactly the kind of grandstanding behavior I will not tolerate." As the bailiff approached, David remained at attention. He made no move to resist, but he also made no move to remove his medal. The Bronze Star caught the light one more time as he was escorted from the witness stand, past the shocked faces in the gallery and out of the courtroom. The prosecutor called for a recess, hoping to find some way to resolve the situation. But David was already being processed for contempt charges and the damage was done. The key witness in the case against Richardson had been removed before he could say a single word about the evidence he'd uncovered. Outside the courtroom, the media had caught wind of what happened. Reporters shouted questions as David was led away, but he said nothing. His lawyer, appointed by the military, was already working on his defense, but everyone knew that contempting a federal judge was serious business. Richardson's defense team saw an opportunity and took it. They immediately filed motions arguing that David's behavior showed he was unstable and unreliable, and that any evidence he'd gathered should be thrown out. They painted him as a disgruntled soldier, trying to hurt his former commanding officer out of spite. The prosecutor tried to explain to the judge that David's testimony was crucial, that without it, the case would be much harder to prove. But Judge Blackwell was unmoved. He'd made his decision and he wasn't backing down. As David sat in the holding cell, still wearing his uniform with the Bronze Star still pinned to his chest, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. He'd risked everything on a matter of principle, and now it looked like Richardson might escape justice because of it. But even as he sat there, facing the possibility of jail time and the end of his military career, David couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the cost was everything you'd worked for. The medal on his chest felt heavier now, weighted with the consequences of his choice. But he still couldn't imagine taking it off. The young soldier he'd saved in Afghanistan had trusted him to do the right thing. The wounded veterans being robbed by Richardson were counting on him to tell the truth. His father had taught him that a man's integrity was the one thing that could never be taken away, only given up. David had chosen to keep his integrity, even if it cost him everything else. Now he could only wait to see what price he would have to pay for that choice. The holding cell at the courthouse was small and cold, nothing like the military facilities David was used to. He sat on the hard bench, still in his dress uniform, the Bronze Star still gleaming on his chest. For the first time since this all began, he had a moment to really think about what had just happened and what it might mean for his future. David's military-appointed lawyer, Captain Patricia Walsh, arrived within an hour. She was a sharp woman in her 30s who specialized in military law, and she looked worried as she sat down across from him in the small meeting room. "Sergeant Thompson," she began, "I'm going to be direct with you. What you did in there was either very brave or very stupid, and right now I'm not sure which. Contempt of a federal judge is serious business. We're talking about possible jail time, and almost certainly the end of your military career." David nodded slowly. He'd known the risks when he made his choice, but hearing them laid out so clearly still hit hard. "Captain, I couldn't take off that medal. It would have been wrong." Captain Walsh studied him for a moment. "Tell me about the medal. Help me understand why it was worth risking everything." David took a deep breath and told her about that day in Afghanistan. He described the explosion, the burning vehicle, the 3 wounded soldiers trapped inside. He talked about running through enemy fire, not once but 3 times to pull each man to safety. He told her about the youngest soldier, barely out of high school, who would have died if David hadn't gone back for him. "The Bronze Star isn't just a piece of metal," David explained. "It represents a promise I made that day, to never leave a fellow soldier behind, to always do what's right no matter the cost. Those wounded veterans that Richardson stole from, they're my fellow soldiers too. Taking off that medal to testify against him would have broken that promise." Captain Walsh was quiet for a long moment. "I understand your position, David, I really do. But the legal reality is that you directly defied a judge's order in open court. That's not something we can easily defend, no matter how noble your motives were." Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, word of what had happened was spreading quickly. Someone in the courtroom had recorded part of the exchange on their phone, and within hours the video was all over social media. The hashtag #ThosterStandWithThompson was trending, with thousands of people sharing their opinions about what had happened. The response was mixed and intense. Many people, especially veterans and their families, saw David as a hero who had stood up for his principles against an unfair order. They pointed out that white veterans had testified in similar cases without being asked to remove their medals, suggesting that something else might be motivating the judge's decision. but others argued that judges had the right to control their courtrooms, and that David had shown dangerous disrespect for civilian authority. Some questioned whether he was really the reliable witness the prosecution claimed, pointing to his defiance as evidence of poor judgment. The story caught the attention of major news networks, and soon reporters were digging into David's background, Judge Blackwell's history, and the details of the corruption case itself. What had started as a straightforward criminal trial was becoming a national debate about military service, civilian authority, and racial justice. Back at Fort Liberty, David's commanding officers were in crisis mode. Colonel Henderson, the base commander, had already received calls from the Pentagon asking for explanations. The last thing the Army wanted was a controversy that made them look like they either couldn't control their soldiers or were abandoning one who had done the right thing. David's fellow instructors were divided. Some supported his stand completely, saying they would have done the same thing. Others worried that his defiance would reflect poorly on all of them and make their jobs harder. A few quietly suggested that David should have just followed the judge's order and dealt with the consequences later. The soldiers David taught were watching closely too. Many of them looked up to him as a mentor and example. They'd heard stories about his Bronze Star and the actions that earned it. Now they were seeing him put his career on the line for his principles, and it was a powerful lesson about what it really meant to serve with honor. Lieutenant Colonel Richardson's defense team was working overtime to capitalize on the situation. They filed motion after motion, arguing that David's behavior proved he was unstable and unreliable. They claimed his defiance of the judge showed the same disregard for authority that had led him to make false accusations against their client. The lead defense attorney, a well-connected lawyer named Hamilton Cross, held a press conference outside the courthouse. "What we saw today," he declared, was a desperate attempt by a disgruntled soldier to turn a courtroom into a stage for his personal grievances. Sergeant Thompson's refusal to follow a simple, reasonable order from the court shows exactly the kind of poor judgment that calls all of his testimony into question. But the prosecution wasn't giving up. Assistant District Attorney Collins knew that without David's testimony, her case against Richardson would be much weaker. She worked through the night, researching legal precedents and looking for any way to get David back on the witness stand. She found cases where courts had ruled that requiring witnesses to remove military uniforms or decorations could be seen as prejudicial or discriminatory. She discovered instances where similar orders had been overturned on appeal, but she also knew that getting Judge Blackwell to reverse his decision would be almost impossible. The media attention continued to grow. CNN ran a primetime special about military veterans and the justice system. Fox News brought on experts to debate whether David's actions were heroic or insubordinate. Local news stations interviewed people on the street, getting a wide range of opinions about what had happened. David's wife, Linda, was struggling to cope with the sudden attention. Reporters camped outside their base housing, trying to get interviews. Their phone rang constantly with calls from news shows, documentary producers, and book publishers. Linda had always been proud of her husband's service, but she hadn't signed up for this kind of public scrutiny. Their children, ages 8 and 10, didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could sense the tension. Kids at school were asking questions, and some parents were treating the family differently. Linda tried to shield them from the worst of it, but it was impossible to completely protect them from the storm swirling around their father. On the third day after the contempt citation, David was released on his own recognizance pending a hearing on the charges. As he walked out of the courthouse, he was met by a crowd of supporters holding signs and chanting his name. But there were also protesters, some holding signs calling him a disgrace to the uniform. David said nothing to the reporters shouting questions at him. He walked through the crowd with the same military bearing he'd shown in the courtroom, got into his wife's car, and went home. But he knew that this was far from over. That evening, his phone rang. It was General Morrison, the commanding general of Fort Liberty. The conversation was brief and formal, but the message was clear. David needed to come in for a meeting the next morning to discuss his future in the Army. As David hung up the phone, he looked at Linda and saw the worry in her eyes. They both knew that his military career was hanging by a thread. The Army couldn't afford to have soldiers who defied civilian courts, no matter how noble their reasons might be. But David also knew that he couldn't have made any other choice. Standing there in that courtroom, facing Judge Blackwell's order, he had felt the weight of every principle his father had taught him, every value the military had instilled in him, and every promise he'd made to his fellow soldiers. The Bronze Star still sat on his uniform, still catching the light, still representing that moment in Afghanistan when he'd chosen to risk everything to save his fellow soldiers. Now he'd made the same choice again in a very different battlefield, and he was prepared to face whatever consequences came with it. David spent that night writing in his journal, something he'd done since his first deployment. He wrote about the choice he'd made, the reasons behind it, and his hopes for the future. He wrote about his love for the Army and his commitment to the values it represented, even if those values sometimes put him at odds with the institution itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new consequences. But tonight, David Thompson could sleep knowing that he'd kept faith with the soldier he'd saved in Afghanistan, with the veterans Richardson had stolen from, and with the oath he'd taken when he first put on the uniform. Sometimes that had to be enough. The meeting with General Morrison was scheduled for 8 in the morning, but David arrived at headquarters 30 minutes early. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night thinking about what he would say and how he would explain his actions. The Bronze Star felt heavier than usual as he walked through the familiar corridors of the building where he'd reported for duty countless times. General Morrison was a career soldier who'd worked his way up from enlisted ranks. He understood the military mindset, but he also understood politics and the pressures that came from Washington. When David entered his office, the general gestured to a chair but remained standing himself. "Sergeant Thompson," General Morrison began, his voice carefully neutral. "I've been on the phone with the Pentagon for the past 12 hours. Your situation has created what they're calling a significant complication for the Army's relationship with civilian courts and the justice system." David sat at attention, waiting for the general to continue. He could see the stress in the older man's face and knew that his actions had created problems that went far beyond his own career. "The Secretary of the Army wants to know how one of our soldiers ended up in contempt of a federal court," the general continued. "The media is calling every hour asking for statements. Veterans groups are split down the middle about whether to support you or condemn you. And frankly, David, I'm not sure what the hell we're supposed to do about any of it." David chose his words carefully. "Sir, I followed my conscience and the values that the Army taught me. I couldn't dishonor the medal or the soldiers it represents." General Morrison finally sat down, looking tired. "I've read your file, Thompson. 15 years of exemplary service, outstanding performance reviews, that Bronze Star you're so protective of. You're exactly the kind of soldier we want to keep, but you've put us in an impossible position." The general explained the political reality. The Army couldn't be seen as supporting a soldier who defied civilian authority, but they also couldn't appear to abandon a decorated veteran who'd done the right thing. The case was being watched closely by Congress, where some members were already questioning military discipline and civilian oversight. Meanwhile, the media storm was intensifying by the hour. The original video from the courtroom had been shared millions of times, with people taking sides based on their own experiences and beliefs. Cable news shows were running segments about the case every hour, bringing on experts to debate the legal and ethical issues involved. Dr. Patricia Williams, a professor of military law at Georgetown University, appeared on multiple shows arguing that Judge Blackwell's order was inappropriate and possibly discriminatory. "Military decorations are not costume jewelry," she explained to one interviewer. "They represent specific acts of valor and service. Asking a veteran to remove them is like asking a police officer to remove their badge." But former federal prosecutor Robert Chen took the opposite view on another network. "No matter how noble Sergeant Thompson's intentions may have been, we cannot have witnesses picking and choosing which court orders to follow. The rule of law depends on everyone, including decorated veterans, respecting the authority of our judges." The debate was playing out on social media as well, where the divide seemed to follow predictable lines. Veterans and their supporters overwhelmingly backed David, sharing their own stories of discrimination and unfair treatment. Others worried about the precedent being set and the importance of respecting civilian authority over the military. Stand with Thompson was trending globally, with celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens weighing in, Former NFL quarterback and veteran Alex Rodriguez tweeted, "I wore my medals to court when I testified in a similar case. Nobody asked me to remove them. Makes you wonder why this soldier was treated differently." But others pushed back hard. Conservative commentator Lisa Chang posted, "Military service doesn't give you the right to disrespect our courts. This soldier's defiance is dangerous and sets a terrible example for others." The story had also caught the attention of international media, with foreign news outlets covering it as an example of racial tensions and military-civilian relations in America. The BBC ran a detailed analysis of the case, while papers in Europe and Asia picked up the story as part of broader coverage of American social issues. Back at Fort Liberty, David's daily routine had been completely disrupted. He couldn't go to his regular job teaching recruits because his legal situation made him a distraction. Instead, he was assigned to administrative duties while the Army figured out what to do with him. His fellow instructors had mixed reactions. Sergeant First Class Johnson, who'd served with David in Afghanistan, was completely supportive. "That man saved my life over there," he told anyone who would listen. "If he says that medal stays on, then it stays on. I don't care what any judge says." But others were more concerned about the bigger picture. Master Sergeant Rodriguez worried that David's actions would make it harder for all soldiers to be taken seriously in civilian courts. "I get why he did it," she explained to a small group during lunch. "But now every defense attorney is going to point to this case when they want to discredit military witnesses." The recruits David normally taught were following the story closely, and their reactions were telling. Many saw him as a hero who'd stood up for his principles against unfair treatment, but some worried that his example might encourage them to disobey orders they disagreed with. Private Jackson, a 19-year-old from Ohio, summed up the confusion many felt. "Sergeant Thompson always taught us to follow orders and respect authority. But now he's famous for not following an order. I don't know what to think anymore." The legal implications were becoming clearer as well. David's contempt hearing was scheduled for the following week, and his lawyer was working on a defense strategy. Captain Walsh had found several precedents where similar orders had been overturned, but she was also realistic about their chances before Judge Blackwell. More seriously, the Army was preparing its own investigation into David's conduct. Military justice worked differently than civilian courts, and David could face charges of conduct unbecoming an officer, insubordination, or bringing discredit to the service. Any of these charges could result in court-martial and the end of his career. The corruption case against Lieutenant Colonel Richardson was also being affected. His defense team was using David's contempt citation to argue that the prosecution's key witness was unreliable and biased. They'd filed motions to exclude all of David's evidence, claiming it was tainted by his personal vendetta against their client. Prosecutor Collins was fighting back, but she knew her case was in trouble. The financial records David had discovered were still valid evidence, but without his testimony to explain them, the jury might not understand their significance. She was looking for other witnesses who could testify about Richardson's activities, but none of them had David's credibility or detailed knowledge. Richardson himself seemed confident that the controversy would help his case. In a carefully staged photo opportunity, he was shown visiting wounded veterans at a local hospital, with his lawyer emphasizing his long record of service to veterans and calling David's accusations the desperate lies of a disgruntled subordinate. The political implications were growing as well. Senator Patricia Davis, a Democrat from California and member of the Armed Services Committee, issued a statement supporting David and calling for an investigation into Judge Blackwell's order. "Sergeant Thompson's courage in exposing corruption should be celebrated, not punished," she declared. But Republican Senator Michael Foster from Texas took a different view. "While I respect Sergeant Thompson's service, we cannot allow military personnel to pick and choose which civilian authorities they'll obey. This sets a dangerous precedent that threatens the civilian control of our military that is fundamental to our democracy." The White House was trying to stay out of the controversy, but Press Secretary Jennifer Martinez was asked about it at every briefing. Her careful non-answers satisfied no one, and only added to the perception that the administration was afraid to take a position. David's family was struggling with the constant attention. Their house was still surrounded by reporters and protesters, making normal life impossible. Linda had taken leave from her job as a nurse because the stress was affecting her work. Their children were staying with Linda's parents to get away from the chaos. The phone calls kept coming, from news shows wanting interviews, from lawyers offering to represent David for free, from veterans groups wanting him to speak at rallies. David turned them all down, following his lawyer's advice to stay quiet until the legal issues were resolved. But the pressure was enormous. David had never wanted to be a public figure or a symbol for any cause. He just wanted to do his job, serve his country, and take care of his family. Now he was at the center of a national debate that he'd never asked to be part of. Late one evening, as David sat in his temporary quarters on base, he received an unexpected visitor. Command Sergeant Major Williams, the senior enlisted soldier at Fort Liberty, knocked on his door. The two men had known each other for years, and Williams had always been a mentor and friend. "You know, Thompson," Williams said after they'd talked for a while, "I've been in the Army for 28 years. I've seen a lot of good soldiers make hard choices. Some of them worked out, some of them didn't, but I've never seen a soldier face the kind of pressure you're under right now." David nodded, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. "Sergeant Major, I keep wondering if I made the right choice. Maybe I should have just taken off the medal and testified anyway." Williams was quiet for a moment, then pointed to the bronze star on David's uniform. "You know what that medal really represents, son? It represents a moment when you had to choose between your own safety and doing what was right. You chose right then, and you chose right in that courtroom. The consequences might be painful, but the choice was right." As Williams left, David felt a small measure of peace for the first time in days. He still didn't know what the future held, but he knew he could live with the choice he'd made. Whatever happened next, he'd face it with the same integrity that had guided him through 15 years of military service and one impossible moment in a federal courtroom. 3 weeks after the courtroom incident, David found himself sitting across from General Morrison again. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The general's face was grim, and there were several other officers present, including the base legal officer and a representative from the Pentagon. David knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "Sergeant Thompson," General Morrison began formally, "after extensive consultation with the Department of the Army and legal counsel, we've reached a decision regarding your future military service." David sat at attention, his hands steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. He'd known this day was coming, had prepared himself for it, but hearing those words still hit him like a physical blow. The general continued, his voice carefully measured. "The Army finds itself in an unprecedented situation. Your service record is exemplary, your actions in Afghanistan were heroic, and your discovery of Lieutenant Colonel Richardson's financial irregularities showed integrity and dedication to duty." David felt a flicker of hope, but the general's expression told him there was more coming. "However, your refusal to comply with a federal judge's order, regardless of your personal feelings about that order, constitutes a serious breach of military discipline. We cannot have soldiers, no matter how well-intentioned, deciding which civilian authorities they will or will not obey." The Pentagon representative, a stern-faced colonel named Davies, leaned forward. "Sergeant Thompson, you're being offered a choice. You can accept immediate retirement with partial benefits, or you can face a court-martial for conduct unbecoming a NT." Thinking about everything that had happened, the lost career, the financial struggles, the stress on his family, then he looked at his son and smiled. "Yes," he said simply, "I would do it again." The bronze star caught the light from the lamp, gleaming just as brightly as it had that day in the courtroom when David had chosen honor over convenience, principle over pragmatism. It represented not just his actions in Afghanistan, but his decision in a federal courthouse, 2 moments when he'd been tested and had chosen to do what he believed was right, regardless of the cost. For David Thompson, that had to be enough.